So you've been talking about what can happen in the context of the developer. Is there any strategy, approach, or maybe tooling that you would suggest to put in those guidelines and guardrails around the developer to help prevent some of this?
Absolutely. So it starts with your endpoint. Do you have the right protections on your endpoint? So there are a variety of different endpoint management solutions. But one of the things that I said about before is a lot of people are seeing Gartner and Forrester are all talking about the need to have that as an integrated solution. So yes, you can have an endpoint solution, but the minute that something happens that makes it go off the endpoint, either to on-prem or to a database or something, you lose visibility. So understanding, remember that golden thread that we talked about before, is it starts on the laptop, I go into GitHub repository, I then go into the cloud, and I find the enhanced credentials. You need to be able to have something that can have visibility across those different silos. Because right now, if people have a best-of-breed siloed approach, you have gaps across each of those silos. And the only way you can really solve that is the way a lot of people are doing today is they're doing integrations to Snowflake for the sole purpose of getting that unified object model. But when you add Snowflake in and then you plug the vendors into it, you have all those different things that have to be normalized. We saw that problem about 7 years ago, and that's why we built the entire data lake on top of OS Query. So you now have that one unified object model that goes from on-prem all the way through to the cloud. Any other questions?
Hello. First of all,
hello.
Cloud security tools for improving security posture requires, and I love this question, elevated permission in the cloud environment, which in itself is a risk to begin with when it has to do with a compromise. How do you guys tackle that, especially in the fintech industry, which involves lots of sensitive data? So again, the question is elevated permissions for cloud-based data.
Exactly. So I'm pleased to say that Uptycs has a lot of experience in financial services. In fact, we have 50% of the top 10 fintech companies out there. So the size, volume, and breadth of the issues that they have there. So the first thing is it comes down to the rigor you put around your development in your CI/CD pipeline. A lot of companies overly permiss applications because I believe it's a 14-step process before someone makes a request and everything it goes through and is approved in AWS. So people will overly permiss those 14,000 permissions to make that happen. So providing your developers best practices around how to tune things is going to be key. And doing that hygiene and doing that assessment to make sure that you're not overly permissing things in your environments. That's the first phase that I would say that you go there. There are many other things that we can do that we can talk about offline to go into greater detail. But the first thing is we would assess the environment to see what's overly permissed and make recommendations as to, hey, this person has had this level, they haven't touched it in 10 months. We can move them down a level or two.
Okay, and that kind of leads very logically into the next question, which is, what are some of the common, the top 3 mistakes, what are some of the top 3 mistakes that you guys see folks making, especially in the fintech space?
So everybody is at some point in their cloud journey. There's part of it that starts as grassroots, where it's kind of behind the scenes, and 2 guys start with this, and they have wildcard access to everything, and then they say, oh, we'll go back and we'll fix that with the right permissions at some point in time. So we'll do an assessment of an environment and we'll say, how come Fred and Lucy have wildcard access to everything in the environment? They're like, can you shut that down immediately? So that's one of the things from a hygiene perspective, because there's an unofficial and then there's official. But everybody thinks there's going to be time to go back and do it right the first time.
So it's basically like technical debt from a cybersecurity perspective.
Exactly. Make sure you have the guardrails in place before you embark on the journey.
But how do you do that if the journey itself started as you said, kind of a wild card, oh, let's just, skunkworks project?
So the time to consult a map is before you get into the woods. So when you're planning a hike or something like that, you look at your map, you understand where you're going to go, so that if you get into trouble, you have a basic understanding of what your plan is if you do get into trouble. And that's probably the biggest thing, is planning things out versus doing them from the hip.
Okay, I'm going to push back on that, even though I think you're 100% correct. The problem is the sorts of people that are going to be like, hey, this cloud thing is really cool, let me go do it, are not the sorts of people that spend all their time preparing maps and then organizing their gear by, type and shape. They're the kind that just will be like, hey, check out those woods, let's go.
Exactly, and that's where we come in. I've worked with some major Fortune 1000 companies where they're unofficially in the cloud for 2 years, officially in the cloud for 3 years, and they end up with this big ball of twine. And they have to unravel that. They hit a critical point where for them to get it adopted throughout the organization, they have to fix some of the things. And it usually comes down to the reporting, the compliance. It's like, hey, if I could give you this really cool report, will you let me run your infrastructure for you? And that's how some of the farmers I've worked with have solved that problem. So yes, people will get into trouble, but you need to be there, with a warm drink and a life preserver, not like the stick and say you did this wrong.
Or possibly a cold drink, because the particular drink
yes.
that you're making available seems
Yes.
to go better over ice.
Yes, that's true.
But let me just double check, but does anyone else have questions while I'm checking to see what we've got online? Because I actually have to refresh to see, which is why I'm sort of fumbling. We're good? Okay. So anything else you want to point out? Because I like the answer, what David just said, if you missed it, was, well, if you're doing everything exactly right, plan before you move. If you're like everyone else in the world, call us once you get into trouble and position it as a better way to get reporting and auditing on what you're actually doing, which I think is a fine answer. Call us is a great answer to somebody who has a solution for a problem.
The only other thing that I would add to that, and it can fall under planning, but do a perimortem. Say, where will this go off the rails? Where do we have concerns? And build a plan for that so that if that does come up, it's not a holy cow type of moment. It's like, oh, we planned for this. Let's take it off the shelf and let's just do that. So you can do it calmly in an organized manner. And that's what a lot of people really fail to do is they put the project plan and everything in place. But quick question on that. Does anybody know, everybody's heard of a plan B, right? Everybody usually has a plan B. Do you know where plan B came from? Otto von Bismarck. His troops came to him and said, here's our attack plan for kind of taking over the world, blah, blah, blah. Here's where we're going to start and do all those kind of things. He goes, well, what if this doesn't work? What do we do then? And they all just kind of looked at him like,
but it's going to work.
What do you mean? I said, what if it doesn't? So then that came up with the plan B strategy. So always have a plan B that is viable and not half thought out.
Excellent, excellent words to live by. David, thank you very, very much.